Hello everyone, welcome to ASEAN Pacific episode. In this episode today, we are going to talk about Canada's role in Indo-Pacific, and also we are going to talk the Indo-Pacific. My guest is Jonathan Berkshire. Jonathan is an international affairs professional with expertise on security, defense, and geoeconomic issues in Indo-Pacific region. He has held a variety of positions in private and public sector. Currently, he is a senior fellow with the Japan Institute of International Affairs. Mila is also director and senior fellow of the Indo-Pacific program at Ottawa-based McDonald Laurier Institute, senior fellow on the East Asia for the Tokyo-based ASEAN Forum, Japan, and the director and the co-founder of the Council of International Policy on International Policy. He also holds appointment as Canada's ASEAN Regional Forum expert and eminent person EP, and as a responsible leader for the BMW Foundation. Welcome, Jonathan. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Lokman. Thank you for your kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Today, first let me start with the Indo-Pacific region. What is the Indo-Pacific region and why it is so important for Canada?
Well, again, thanks for that great question. And I think your timing is very crucial here, as the thinking on the Indo-Pacific is growing quite a bit here in Canada. Actually, we just recently had what we call mandate letters. So our different ministers in our cabinet have mandates on what they're supposed to do, and across a couple different of those ministries, and most particular on foreign affairs, there was a mandate to quote unquote develop and launch an Indo-Pacific strategy. So it's clearly a number one priority for the Canadian government right now to start thinking much more deeply about the Indo-Pacific. What exactly the Indo-Pacific is for Canada, is a crucial question. If you think about Canada's geography, in many ways, it might seem far away from the Indo-Pacific. We only have one border. It's the United States. Not always the easiest border, but nonetheless, a strategic partner and friend for Canada, despite the ups and downs in the relationship sometimes. But the important thing also to think about Canada's geography is that we have three oceans on our sides. In the north, obviously, we have the Arctic Ocean. In the east, we have the Atlantic Ocean. And then, of course, on the west, the large Pacific coastline. So very much Canada has always been a Pacific nation. How it's sort of articulated that and how it's thought about that Pacific nationhood has changed throughout time. And I think right now with the Indo-Pacific thinking, we're realizing that some of the challenges, the opportunities that are happening in this region, no longer does it make sense to just sort of come in and come out, pop into the region, pop back out. But we need a long-term strategic lens in order to manage these risks and take advantage of the opportunities. So I think that's what you're seeing with the Indo-Pacific strategy. Geography is always an important question too. I often get this question asked, where does the geography start and where does the geography end? When you think about the Indo-Pacific, we know that different states like Japan, United States, countries in Europe have developed Indo-Pacific approaches. The Canadian approach isn't out officially yet, but I believe that the geography will sort of stop from South Asia. So it will sort of go from India, Pakistan in the west, and then go all the way to the Pacific Islands on the east side. So I don't think that it'll necessarily extend through towards the Middle East and Eastern Africa as other Indo-Pacific approaches do. But that's not to say that Canada doesn't recognize the importance of those supply chains and how they interact with countries in South Asia and Southeast Asia. But I think for the simplicity of making this strategy, I think that's how Canada thinks about the region.
Now, Jonathan, there is, the reality of China as a growing power and rising power. Where does China play into the Canada's regional strategy, especially when we're talking about the Indo-Pacific and the East China Sea, South China Sea, or East or Northeast Asia? How China play into Canada's strategy here?
That's a really important point. And I think so. A couple of points that are necessary here. Number one, of course, China is a part of the way that we view the Indo-Pacific. They're one of the largest countries in this region, the largest economy in the region. So I think that they're clearly a part of it. In addition, from the political security side, many of the challenges that we're seeing in this region are emanating out of China and Chinese behavior. So that's another key element of the way that we're thinking about this. But the important point to remember here is while China is a part of this strategy, the strategy is not a function of the relationship with China. And I think this is something that's often been debated, not just in Canada, but in other countries in the West, as they've developed Indo-Pacific strategies, is that I think especially the Chinese side has sort of accused countries of developing an Indo-Pacific approach to contain China, essentially using this as an alliance of democracies to box in China. But the reality is that Canada, I think, should not be developing a strategy for that purpose, and is not developing a strategy for that purpose. The reality is that it's developing an Indo-Pacific strategy because it wants to work closely with other states in the region, partners, allies, that believe in international law, that believe in international norms and institutions. And if China is also willing to be a constructive partner in international institutions and adhere to international law, I think China will be included in that group. If China is going to push back on those institutions, push back on international law, I think that we'll have to work with our partners to push back on China. So I think that's the important thing to think about is not to look at the Indo-Pacific and the development of the Indo-Pacific as a sort of a punitive measure or a punishment towards China, but actually to see it in the broader context that I outlined.
No, Jonathan, when we look into the region, the geopolitical or economic importance of this region growing day by day, and many countries one by one try to involve into the region. In one side, the European countries send their warship here, and the US already there, and China, Japan, Australia, South and Northeast Asian countries also involved in this region. What should the future of the relationship look like?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that a lot of different countries are thinking about how they want to articulate their strategic posture in this region. Some of them are closer to home, whether that's Japan or Australia. Some of them are a bit further away, but still have equities and stakes in this region, whether it's some of our European friends, the United Kingdom, even the Germans obviously had a significant naval deployment recently, and the French and others. I think the key takeaway here is not necessarily that all of these states have completely aligned strategies and that they're working in tandem, but I think that they all recognize that the things that are at stake in the Indo-Pacific, whether it's from an institutional perspective, whether it's from an international law perspective, whether it's from an investment and free trade perspective, it's worth working together to preserve. And I think that this is something that you're seeing unprecedented sort of attention across the board. And that's one of the neat things when thinking about the Indo-Pacific is that it's evolved from a couple intellectuals in India and Japan and Australia thinking about this. I mean, if you were to think about the Indo-Pacific concept 15 to 20 years ago, when Quad 1.0 was being talked about, Quad 1.0, basically 15 years ago, barely got off the ground. And now we're at the point 15 years later where not only is Quad 2.0 actively off the ground, but we have many things in the orbit of Quad, whether it's AUKUS, a web of other sort of minilateral arrangements that are happening, in addition to ASEAN itself. And I think this is an important point as well, that these institutions and these alignments are not meant to replace ASEAN, but I think are meant to work in tandem with Southeast Asia and some of the institutions that are outgrowths of ASEAN.
Now, when given the strategic rivalry between China and the US, where can Canada fit in the growing strategic rivalry between these two superpower or growing rising power?
I think that's a really good question. So, and one I often get as well. So a couple thoughts on this. Yes, it is a challenging place to be, and I know that in some senses, we've been, compared to many other U.S. allies who are in a similar boat, whether it's the Japanese, for example, who are a U.S. treaty ally, but live right next to China and have their greatest trading partner is China, despite all of the strategic mistrust. Each situation is uniquely different. So, but the one thing I would say in the Canadian context is, absolutely there are tensions on this. The Canadian side doesn't necessarily want to 100% mimic the American approach. And I think always will have a little bit of difference in all of its foreign policy elements, including how it approaches China and the Indo-Pacific. That being said, I think the idea of us sort of being a neutral player, sort of stuck in the middle between two great powers, trying to find our way, I don't fully buy this sort of idea. The reality, at least in Canada's context, as I mentioned on the onset, our geography sort of defines some of our strategic outlook. We have one neighbor, it's the Americans. And as I said before, not always the greatest neighbor, but still a strategic partner and friend, our greatest trading partner by far, our strategic military ally. So there is no choosing for the Canadian side. It's not about China or the US. We don't want to choose. But clearly, we've chosen, and geography has chosen for us, the Americans. It's how much we can act independently within that sort of context. So how do we not make sure that we're not USA or USB, have some independent foreign policy, but still know, of course, where our eggs are. That's the sort of the challenge that I think Canada has. So, other allies might have it a little bit differently because of their geography and because of where they're positioned vis-a-vis China economically. But Canada, I think, very much is entrenched as a U.S. ally and partner. But we do obviously want to find ways to have independent foreign policy too.
Now, when we're talking about the role and importance of the geography, the ASEAN, I think Southeast Asian countries are at the center of the Indo-Pacific region. So what is the Canada's approach to this region, ASEAN countries in Indo-Pacific context?
I think ASEAN is central to the way that Canada thinks about this region. So even historically, the Canadian side very much has thought about this region as the Asia-Pacific. And this is another note I should say, is that even when an Indo-Pacific strategy comes out in Canada, and I would say this would be the same for other countries who have Indo-Pacific approaches, such as Japan, such as Australia, who talks about the Indo-Pacific a lot, or countries in Europe, it does not mean the end of Asia-Pacific or the end of Asia. Countries will still use those terms. I mean, Canada is still a member of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, is still a member of the Asian Development Bank, in addition to the ASEAN Regional Forum and other bodies that talk about Asia-Pacific. So we will still talk about Asia-Pacific. And we are still cognizant of the fact that most of our engagement from an institutional perspective is in ASEAN. We're a founding partner, a dialogue partner of ASEAN. We've just opened exploratory free trade agreement talks with ASEAN. We now have FTAs through the Trans-Pacific Partnership with several key ASEAN states, including Malaysia and Vietnam, amongst others. So clearly we see ASEAN as a center, not only for institutions, but for economic growth and for discussion on political security issues, as challenging as it may be. I mean, we all know, I'm not going to try to put the rose-colored glasses on. We know it's difficult, obviously, to deal with some of these and to resolve some of these security issues through the ASEAN-related bodies. That being said, I often make the analogy to, you only have one or two cars to drive, and either you end up walking or you drive the cars that you have. And I think in the Indo-Pacific and the Asia-Pacific, most of those cars are centered in ASEAN, those multilateral architecture cars. It's not like Europe where you can choose a fleet of 10 or 20 different multilateral cars. Asia Pacific does not have that sort of architecture that the transatlantic has. So we need to work with what we have. We don't necessarily need to reinvent it, but we need to find ways to complement it. And I think that's where the Indo-Pacific comes in. And actually, I think ASEAN has recognized this. I mean, ASEAN has its own outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which doesn't, necessarily mimic other strategies. I think it has its own ASEAN characteristics, but I think it's ASEAN's recognition that we can't just be complacent. We can't just, pretend, pull the bed sheets over our eyes and pretend that the Indo-Pacific is not a thing. So I think that's very significant.
And now, when we look at Jonathan, when we look at to the region, and sometimes tension are rising, and the region sometimes getting more complicated. In this particular situation, how can Canada balance its interest in Asia versus other regions such as the America and the Europe?
That's a really good question. So, I mean, and it's a sensitive one in many ways too, because I mean, I think the way that again, this would not just be true with Canada, but the way that countries have traditionally positioned themselves in terms of their diplomatic footprint, so where they have their embassies overseas, how much staff they have in their embassies overseas, where they prioritize trade relationships, where they see themselves internationally and in foreign policy terms. It's hard to change those things. I mean, some of those become sort of corporate memory, and in order to change those things, it requires a really big and not a 1 to 2 year rethink, but a 10 to 20, 30 year rethink. So it's really difficult, but I think those questions have to be asked, and a couple of reasons why they do. Number one, we're going through a brutal pandemic right now that has lasted longer than many of us hoped. And while we hope, obviously, this year will be a better year, and maybe we might see the sort of the light at the end of the tunnel, there's going to be a lot of economic pain even when the tunnel's over. I think the economic reckoning is going to be coming for Canada and for other countries that are going to have to deal with long periods where a lot of people, the workforce was just simply not working to the standpoint that they were before. So that is going to put enormous pressures on budgets. So the idea that there's going to be new money for priorities like the Indo-Pacific, I think is a bit of, it's going to be challenging. I think there is a need for some new money, but the reality is that money is not going to come on addition or on top of what we're already doing. It's going to have to be taken from other areas. So that's going to require very difficult choices. From the Canadian side, a lot of our traditional diplomacy and a lot of the way that we've dispersed our money, whether it's in diplomatic terms or defense terms or development terms, I think has been prioritized, number one, on the multilateral institutions. And number two, we focused a lot, obviously, in Europe and in the Americas. And even our engagement in Asia, I think, is primarily focused a lot on our engagement with China. I think that sort of focus is going to have to start looking a little bit more dynamically. I think one of the key things of the Indo-Pacific strategy is realizing that this region, while it includes China, is bigger than China. So rather than necessarily centering ourselves in Beijing or in China and saying, okay, this is the core to what we're thinking about in this region, and everything else sort of matters, I think we're going to have to rethink that approach. And part of that will be recruiting language specialists that speak other languages other than Mandarin, but also thinking about investing and nurturing some of the hubs that we have in Southeast Asia, whether it's Malaysia, Vietnam, Singapore, Indonesia, etc., in tandem with some of the key Northeast Asia allies such as South Korea and Japan. So it's going to be a pretty big effort. My last point on this is that I think it doesn't have to be only a government effort. So it does matter, obviously, what the government does, high-level visits of the prime minister and ministers. But this also is in the hands of the private sector and civil society. So I think the government can help on this. I think they can help sort of nurture this and push this and promote this. But I do think that this is going to be something that the private sector needs to think about how it engages deeply with this part of the world too.
There is a few questions, Jonathan. I'm going to let me bring. Given Russia and China's growing strategic alignment in the Indo-Pacific, what kind of security implications will it have on Canada? That
That's
is
a
a
really
question.
That's a great question, Oliver. Thank you. And I think it does have some pretty significant implications. Clearly, when Canada thinks of its outlook now on states that it's worried about in security terms, and we actually just released a poll with one of the think tanks I work with, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, yesterday, looking at threat perceptions in Canada and which countries in particular that Canada sees as a security threat. Probably unsurprisingly, topping that list were Russia and China. So the idea of a convergence of the two, more military exercises, I think is inherently going to be concerning to Canadians. One caveat, obviously, to put on this is that I think that the alignment between Russia and China, while real in many ways, and I think there's, we see this in the Indo-Pacific, I think we see this in Europe as well with an increased military exercise, increased sort of diplomatic activity. There still is strategic mistrust, I think, between the two. They may not, acknowledge it all the time, but I think you need only look at, for example, the recent episode in Kazakhstan, where I think the Russians were very happy to very quickly enter Kazakhstan, probably before the Chinese could make any sort of analysis or assessment of what they should do in this region as well. And also sort of reasserting that, okay, this area in Central Asia is really our sort of backyard to the Chinese side. So that caveat being said, I think there is a real concern of alignment right now. It presents some unique challenges. So the way that Canada in particular views these two different challenges, number one, we think of Russia in the transatlantic realm predominantly. So Canada has a deployment right now in Latvia, in the Baltics, looking at sort of reassuring NATO on its eastern flank. So that's one lens that we're worried about Russia. The second, and obviously, this is a consistent way that we think about Russia, is in the Arctic. So we were, Russia is not necessarily I would say, a persistent threat in the Arctic. They're a reality in the Arctic. I mean, they're an Arctic power, but how they sort of articulate themselves in the Arctic is constantly a concern for the Canadian side. So how much bandwidth does the Canadian side have to pay attention to Russian activities in the Indo-Pacific is a question. The Chinese side, on the other side, is almost becoming an emerging threat perception in Canada. I think those who studied China for a while have realized that China has been a challenge for some time. But it's only recently that we're starting to see that some of these issues in the Indo-Pacific could really impact Canada. So that convergence, I think it's a real challenge. I think we're not alone in thinking on this. My last point is that I think that the Five Eyes, which is a intelligence sharing group with Anglo countries, including the United States, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, I think increasingly we'll be looking at this sort of convergence as well and its implications for them.
Okay. As compared to the other US allies in the region and in the EU, do you think Canada's involvement in the region is a desirable level?
So I think that really what we're thinking about with the Indo-Pacific is not necessarily there's like a cap to like it's a concert where you have a ticket cap and you say, okay, well, we already have 10 at the show. Canada, your priority is a bit lower. So at this point, we don't really need a Canadian Indo-Pacific approach. I think this is sort of one of these like poker games where all in. It's not about necessarily a few states, for example, the Quad, who can contribute the most, who are resident powers, who have grand visions for this. But I think it's about different states thinking about different niches and different opportunities. The challenge will be that exact point. So I agree with you. I mean, clearly the United States, through its history, through its capital in the region, through its alliances, even despite obviously its missteps in recent years, namely withdrawing from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the United States, there's no comparing Canada to the United States and its sort of influence in the Indo-Pacific. Probably, or some of the key European states like the UK and France, which France in particular, which has Indo-Pacific assets and has military assets that outweigh the Canadian side. That being said, I think that a Canadian voice can be seen as an addition here and as sort of as a multiplier. We need to think very carefully about where our value is, though. So rather than just sort of showing up and saying, we're interested also, we like the Indo-Pacific, we think it's important, where can we fit in? I think we actually need to come to the theater with concrete ideas on where we can be unique, where we can have our comparative advantage. And I think there are certain areas there that we can play. One of them I think will be on, what some people might refer to as non-traditional security or soft security, but on things such as humanitarian assistance, disaster relief. Canada has a very well-equipped DART team that worked actually in the Philippines in the aftermath of Typhoon Haiyan. Things such as this, I think the Canadian forces side will be very good on. I also think that we can continue to do very good things on the development side, and this might require a rethinking of our development priorities and where we sort of put them. But there are ways I think that we can engage. My last point on this is I think Canada is one of the key countries in the Asian Development Bank, one of the key shareholders there. So that's another institution that we can sort of use in order to sort of have a comparative advantage in this region.
Yes. Since earlier to 2000, could you say security architecture in East Asia dramatically changed in favor of Beijing?
I don't know that. I would say some of the, I don't know if demographic reality is the right thing, but just the nature of China's economy and how much money it's been able to, put into the military modernization, I think has bolstered China's sort of military posture. I think a lot of people would recognize that. And see, even if we believe some of their defense budgets, it's significant. But clearly, the unreported side of this, and again, whether this is from a missile perspective, whether this is from a cyber warfare perspective, there's so many different levels where China has qualitatively improved. Still not obviously at the level of the U.S. and its allies, but that's significant. From an architecture perspective, though, in many ways, I actually think China has weakened itself since 2000. And part of the reason on this is that it's given new life to the architecture that reins it in. And this is the U.S. alliance network. So if you think about in the year 2000, I think some of the alliance network was still very much bilateral, still very much focused on very defined issues. So for example, the U.S. ROK alliance very much focused on North Korea, the U.S.-Japan alliance very much focused on the defense of Japan, the U.S.-Australia alliance focused on the Pacific and Australia. Now you're seeing, whether it's through agreements like AUKUS, like the development of the Quad, in addition to collaboration between U.S. allies, so not actually even springboarded on the Americans. Australia and Japan is the most significant example of this in their recent reciprocal access agreement. Much of this has been pushed by China's security behavior in the region. So I actually think from an architecture perspective and from the environment around it, things have become more severe, probably because of some of China's behavior. So in my sense, it's actually adversarial to China's interests, unless they do have interest in sort of ramping up security competition in order to drive their military modernization, which I think is another question. But it's a really excellent question, and thank you for that.
Jolie said during an interview, Canada is working on a new strategy for its relationship with increasingly influential China. Does it mean that existing Indo-Pacific strategies aren't enough?
Thank you, Maria.
Is it the Canada Foreign Minister? Am I right?
Yes, you're right. Yeah, Minister Jolie. Yes, so she would be the minister tasked with finally developing and launching this strategy. It's a great question, Maria. So I think that it's not necessarily that the current strategies are insufficient, but every country is going to have to come up with their own strategy. I think that's even from a branding perspective. I mean, you've seen this even in the United States with when the Obama administration went from pivot to rebalance, and then Trump called it the free and open Indo-Pacific. The American side now is still using FOIP terminology, but I think the Biden administration, you'll see, will come up with a different sort of framing. So even within a country, political parties want to have their own branding on something, even if the reality of the strategy doesn't change much. From a foreign side, you'll notice that different countries also want to have their own imprint, want to have their own unique sort of way to think about this. So I think this is what Minister Jolie is sort of inferring, is that yes, we will take some of the best parts of the American approach, the Japanese approach, the ASEAN approach, the approaches from our European friends, India, Australia, etc. But it needs to be a made in Canada strategy that recognizes our capabilities, our interests, our values, and goes forward in that direction. So I think that's basically what she's sort of tasked with doing, is making sure that this is a strategy that really fits with Canada. The one thing that I would note that I think is really important as this strategy develops is that we make sure that this is not a sort of a tactical deliverable. So government often lives in this world where we work hard to get something out, and it's out, and a lot of hand clapping, and then there's the so what factor. This type of strategy is not a sort of a task force or a 5, 10 year, 20-year lift. This is a 50, 100 year in the minimum sort of effort. It's a long-term strategic way to think about the region, which is going to be the most consequential region for Canada's foreign policy going forward. So we really need to think about it in that sense. We have to resist the temptation to think about this as a sort of a quick fix. And okay, we have a strategy now. We've devoted a little bit of new money, and in 5 years we can shift to something else. So that understanding, I think it's there from the Canadian side, but I think that really needs to be thought of. It needs to be bipartisan. It needs to be something that's not just from the Liberal side, but on the Conservative side too. And it needs to involve more than just government, as I mentioned before. It needs to involve civil society, business, academics, universities, think tanks, students, and others, in order to be successful.
Jonathan, through these questions, in the upcoming years, could we say that Canada's involvement in the region will increase?
I think it will. Yeah, I think this is something that this is a train that is not reversing course. Not only are other countries realizing this and moving forward, but I think Canada's realizing this too. So there's no way but forward. I think it's a question about how much and in what sort of ways. So, how much attention do we pay to this train? How many passengers are we putting on the train going forward? And in what ways? So the sort of thematics are important, because I think traditionally the way that Canada has thought about itself in this region is that generally, I'm paraphrasing it, but basically we're very interested in the markets of the Indo-Pacific. We want to find ways to take advantage of that economic growth. Obviously promote some of our values and interests in the sort of meantime, but we really haven't thought about the challenges of the Indo-Pacific as critical or consequential to Canadian interests. That, not saying that everyone has had that impression, but generally that has been the sense that the security issues in this region really are issues that are the Americans' problem, or the problem of other partners in this region, such as Japan, South Korea, or friends in ASEAN or Australia. That thinking needs to change. I think we need to realize that while we may not be the Americans and we may not be the Australians in military and defense terms, we need to have a balanced strategy that takes advantage of economic opportunities and engages with the dynamism of the economies in the Indo-Pacific, but also recognizes the real security challenges and finds a niche and a role, not just to talk about them, not just to sort of mention it in a talking point from a government statement, but to actually find concrete, tangible ways to contribute to peace and stability in the region. So I think that's the sort of the thread that we need to feather.
I think there is one of the last question about Taiwan. How Taiwan's strategic importance can be interpreted for Canada?
That's a great question, Andrea. Thank you. I think Taiwan is critical. So just recently, this week, actually, Canada announced that we will be engaging in FIPA. So, investment protection agreement talks with Taiwan. I also think that Canada should be supportive of Taiwan's accession to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I know that this has been difficult now with China's application as well, which I think has been done primarily to block Taiwan's accession. But I think the economic importance of Taiwan to Canada is crucial. Obviously, in supply chain terms, its semiconductor industry, et cetera, is going to be the future of technology. It already is, so critical to technology supply chains, et cetera. So Taiwan's critical from that perspective. Another reason Taiwan's critical is just from a military strategic side. As we all know, from a First Islands chains perspective, Taiwan is right in the middle of the East China Sea and the South China Sea. Its strategic importance, to the Senkaku dispute between Japan and China, between some of the disputes between China and friends in Southeast Asia and the South China Sea. If the status quo is to be altered in Taiwan, it fundamentally changes the strategic status quo in both the South China Sea and ASEAN, and also with Japan. So that raises very uncomfortable questions for all of us when we go forward. The final thing I think that's important to think about Taiwan, and again, this doesn't get talked about enough, is Taiwan is a really thriving democracy in this region. And it's a region that frankly doesn't have very many thriving democracies. So we have a lot of friends and partners in the region. But when we actually look at democracies, we have the key allies, Northeast Asia, Japan and South Korea. We have Taiwan. And we have Australia and New Zealand on the flank. And we do have democratic friends in Southeast Asia, but democracy also is challenged in this part of the world too. So we want to nurture relationships with ASEAN, but it's a balancing act where a democracy is going through its growing pains, and in some terms it has never really taken off in some parts of ASEAN. So this is it's a challenge, and we want to court and display democracies in this region rather than sort of marginalizing them and sort of offering them up. So I think Taiwan is of critical importance to Canada and to our partners.
So, Jonathan, as I understand the entire go of conversation, the Canada approach to the Indo-Pacific involvement to the Indo-Pacific region will not be like the US totally militarily, and will not be less only the soft involvement. It will be a balance, when necessary it will involve as a military power, but when necessary it will also involve to the region as economic and academic and civil involvement. Am I right?
I think you're right, and in a way, I mean, on the military side, much of this has sort of already been happening, but we haven't really had a strong narrative because there isn't a strategy. So, if you think in Sea of Japan, around North Korea, we've been engaged in what we call Operation Neon, which is an exercise with our Five Eyes Plus partners, including Japan, to ensure that North Korean vessels aren't able to circumvent sanctions, or other vessels that might want to circumvent sanctions against the DPRK as a result of its nuclear weapons program. We've also obviously been involved in an innocent passage navigation exercise with the Americans in the Taiwan Straits, several sort of exercises and deployments in Southeast Asia, port visits, etc. So there are activities happening from a defense side. I think there does need to be a bit more, but the largest thing is that with a strategy in place, you're able to sort of frame this activity in a much more concrete way. But I would agree with you. I mean, on your broader point that, you'll see, I hope that you'll see a Canadian engagement that is unique, sort of takes a balance on economic and trade side, but also the security side. And it won't be identical to the Americans, but I think in many ways it will complement. It will complement parts of the American approach and strategy, but will also complement some from our other partners, including Japan, including Australia, New Zealand, and including friends in Southeast Asia, and in many ways India as well. So that's my hope and aspiration.
Okay, Jonathan, thank you very much. I think I come to the end of my question, and also my audience's question are done.
Thank you so much, Lokman. It was a great session, and appreciate all the audience questions too. Very sharp questions and good questions.
Thank you very much for joining me also for this great conversation. Also, thank you for my audiences for such terrific questions. Stay tuned for next upcoming shows. Following us, please. Thank you.